Well, hi there. Welcome back as we continue in our journey of the book of James. We're starting out in a new study of James. We just finished with the life of David. And so now we're moving into a study of James before we get to Advent. And it'll get all crazy. We'll take a break at Advent and we'll focus on Advent for a while. And then when we get back from the Advent, we'll finish up James. So that's where we're going. If you're curious, if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to James chapter 1. And we'll take a look at that this morning. In an online article for Leadership Journal, John Ortberg discusses how adverse situations are necessary for our spiritual growth. He writes, psychologist Jonathan Haidt had a hypothetical exercise. Imagine that you have a child, and for 5 minutes you're given a script, you're given a script of what will be that child's life. You get an eraser. You can edit it. You can take out whatever you want. You read that your child will have a learning disability in grade school. Reading, which comes easily for some kids, will be laborious for yours. In high school, your kid will make a great circle of friends, then one of them will die of cancer. After high school, this child will actually get into the college they wanted to attend, but while there, they will be in a car crash and your child will lose a leg and go through a difficult depression. A few years later, your child will get a great job, then lose that job in an economic downturn. Your child will get married, but then go through the grief of separation. When you get the script for your child's life and have 5 minutes to edit it, what would you erase? Wouldn't you take out all the stuff that would cause them pain? I'm part of a generation of adults called helicopter parents. Yeah, me too, John. I fit the bill as well. Because we're constantly trying to swoop into our kids' educational life, relational life, sports life, etc., to make sure no one is mistreating them, no one is disappointing them. We want them to experience one unobstructed success after another. One Halloween, a mom came to our door to trick or treat. Why didn't she send in her kid? Well, the weather's a little bad, she said, and she was driving so he didn't have to walk in the mist. But why not send him to the door? He had fallen asleep in the car, she said, so she didn't want to have to wake him up. I felt like saying, why don't you eat all his candy and get his stomach ache for him too? Then he can be completely protected. If you could wave a wand, if you could erase every failure, setback, suffering, and pain, are you sure that it would be a good idea? Would it cause your child to grow up to be a better, stronger, more generous person? Is it possible that in some way people actually need adversity, setbacks, maybe even something like trauma to reach the fullest level of development and growth? Whether we like it or not, adversity is a gift from God. It forces us to grow up. This morning, we are starting on a brief journey through the book of James. And James gets the rep as one of the most practically applicable books in all of the Bible. This morning, I want us to highlight and take a look at this strange economy of God that highlights our lowlights and puts great value on things we would rather avoid, like pain and loss. Let's go ahead and dive into our scripture this morning. Starting with verse 2. Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. But when you ask him, be sure that your faith is in God alone. Do not waver, for a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as a wave of the sea that is blown and tossed by the wind. Such people should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they are unstable in everything they do. Believers who are poor have something to boast about, for God has honored them. And those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. They will fade away like little flowers in the field. The hot sun rises and the grass withers. The little flower droops and falls, and its beauty fades away. In the same way, the rich will fade away with all their achievements. God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. Whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes or casts a shifting shadow. He chose to give birth to us by giving us his true word, and we, out of all creation, became his prized possession. All right, let's dive into this a little bit. Who is James? Well, let's back up a step more. James isn't really James. James is actually an Anglo-Saxon name. It's English, and basically it came about in translating our Bibles. They translated it from Jacob to James. And so that's how we get James as the title of the book. But Jacob is actually the writer. He's the author, and it's the Hebrew name of the author, and he is the half-brother of Jesus. He is the half-brother of Jesus, and he's the leader of the church in Jerusalem. After Peter takes his leadership role and kind of moves it to Antioch, and he moves out of Jerusalem, James is left as the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and then Stephen is martyred. And Stephen is martyred, and that creates basically a hot zone inside of Jerusalem. It's too hot to be a Christian inside of Jerusalem, and so there's a great dispersion that takes place, and people begin to flee and leave Jerusalem and go into all different parts of the world. And this wasn't terribly new. The Jews had a synagogue in every major metropolitan city, and so these Jewish Christians would have had a cultural home wherever they went, even in the Greco-Roman world. And so they went, and this was the letter to them, basically giving James instruction as someone who was their spiritual authority, and through their dispersion kind of continues this role as their teacher. Well, James has an interesting flavor. He really highlights the Sermon on the Mount and Proverbs, and he writes in a very similar fashion to both of those. So I want us just to consider the situation for a second. You fled your home because of your faith in Jesus. And it's a good thing that you did, because Jerusalem's going to be destroyed in your lifetime. And you're wondering, how do we follow Jesus' teaching in the everyday when we don't have the church around like we did? In his book, Hope is Contagious, Ken Hutcherson shares a moment from his personal life that illustrates well the ability to foster joy in the midst of trying circumstances, even as he was battling cancer. You can face anything in life, anything, and have that same inner peace and joy. And when you do, it's contagious. It lifts up everyone else around you. Isn't that the type of person you want to be? Instead of joining over and over again in the whining about how bad things are, just your presence shows others that, hey, life is still a wonderful gift we should all be enjoying. One day I was relaxing in my recliner after having spent 5 hours in the emergency room the night before. I'll admit I was exhausted, and the pain medication wasn't working as well as I would have liked. I looked around and saw my family going about their lives as usual. Video games, chores, music, laughter. My wife Pat was fixing breakfast. Even our new little puppy was settling into a comfortable routine and enjoying everyone's efforts to spoil him. A visitor stopped by to chat. Some friends from church surprised me with a birthday cake. I had almost forgotten it was my birthday. So there I sat, surrounded by so much goodness, even as I was feeling lousy. My favorite cake is staring at me, but I have no appetite. My 11-year-old runs past me, and I don't have enough energy to grab him and wrestle him to the ground like I used to. I'm trying to have a conversation with my guest, but between the short night and the powerful pain pills, I can barely stay alert. And you know what I'm thinking? Can you imagine how close I am to being overwhelmed with what is happening to me? The words practically shouted from inside of me. Isn't God great? What a privilege to be his child. Somehow in the midst of the challenge of adversity, the beacon call of God on our lives becomes clearer. We were meant for more than this, and adversity reveals that. James says in verse 4, adversity will grow you up until you are perfect. Now we need to be careful here, because when we translate the word perfect, there's always kind of a mess that happens. Our version of perfect and the Greek version of perfect were not the same idea. Our version of perfect is to not make any mistakes. So when a pitcher in baseball pitches a perfect game, he gets out all 21 batters. Nobody ever goes through and gets on base. Nobody gets a hit. It's a perfect game. There were no mistakes made through the entire game. And so we kind of think of perfection as the lack of mistakes, being perfect. And that wasn't the Greek view of perfection. The Greek view of perfection was the idea of being a whole person, a wholeness. versus the fractured dissonance of people who believe or say one thing and then live and act another way. It's that dissonance that we have. The Greeks didn't really know what to call it or how to address it. The Hebrews called it the sin nature. But there's a dissonance in us. There's a break between the who we want to be and the who that we are. And that dissonance is a brokenness. And so James says that adversity will grow you up until you are perfect. In other words, adversity will grow you up until there is no dissonance in your life between what you say and what you do. Until you're a whole person. And there's not that fracturing there. Now, whether this happens on this side of eternity or not is a question for theologians that are smarter than I am. But I'll leave that for another day. But James teaches us to be a whole person, not someone that's tossed about by the next thing that comes down the pike. In verses 5 and 6, James draws from Proverbs and cautions his readers to seek wisdom, but how to seek wisdom matters. James says if we want to be wise, to ask God, because wisdom is a gift from him. In particular, James is talking about wisdom during times of adversity. This isn't the run-of-the-mill, just give me wisdom like Solomon so that I can know the answers to everything, or just make me like Google so that I always know the answer to every question. This is, what do I do, Lord? What steps are my next right steps do I take in the face of adversity? Where do we go from here? That's the wisdom that James is talking about. And he says if you ask God in the face of adversity for wisdom, that he'll be good about giving it to you. Just don't ask if you're wishy-washy. Don't ask if you're hedging your bets. Only ask if you really want it. That's what James means when he says don't have a divided mind on these things that are happening. In other words, don't try to juggle faith and philosophy and overthink what is happening. You can't slip in and out of your faith the way you do a set of clothes. This doesn't mean that we can't question and doubt genuinely. What it does mean is that if we want to know the why of the adversity, look to God and his purposes in us. So many times I think we want to blame God for the adversity we have, which might not be right, but at least it's honest. Or worse, we try to deflect the blame from God and protect God from our own doubts. Let me just say this. God is bigger than your uncertainty. He is bigger than your doubts. James isn't talking about doubt like someone who doubts the existence of God, but rather someone who doubts the reality of God in our daily lives. Someone who doubts God's providence and authority working in and through us. Nor is he talking about merely self-doubt, doubting our abilities. In this case, the ability to see through the mess that we are in. That's the abilities that we need. In his new film, A Hologram for the King, Tom Hanks plays a middle-aged American businessman who's sent to Saudi Arabia, where the king is planning to build a new city in the middle of the desert. Hank's character, Adam Clay, must persuade the Saudis to let the company he works for provide IT technology and support for this new city. In an interview after the film debuted, Hanks told Terry Gross, host of NPR's Fresh Air, that he felt particularly connected with his character's sense of self-doubt and dislocation. Hanks said, "No matter what we've done, there comes a point where you think, how did I get here? When are they going to discover that I am in fact a fraud and take everything away from me?" Despite having won 2 Academy Awards and appearing in more than 70 films and TV shows, Hanks says he still finds himself doubting his own abilities. "It's a high-wire act that we all walk," he told Terry Gross. "There are days when I know that at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to have to deliver some degree of emotional goods. And if I can't do it, that means that I'm going to have to fake it. And if I fake it, that means they might catch me at faking it. And if they catch me at faking it, well, then that's just doomsday." I love that honest line. When are they going to discover that I am in fact a fraud and take everything away from me? And that's where grace steps in. Because the truth is, none of us are who we are cracked up to be. We're all broken. We're all working our way towards wholeness, allowing Christ to move in us and work in us. But none of us are who we're cracked up to be. I love that honesty, that line. When are they going to find out I'm a fraud and take everything away from me? Then we get to verses 9 and 11, and we get this glimpse of what I call God's mixed up economy. And what I mean by that is that what God values is seldom what we value, and vice versa. God puts a high price tag on things that we would rather avoid, like adversity. Look what James says here, and he's quoting the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor, for God has honored them, and blessed are the rich, for they have learned humility. Now, how often do we think of the rich and humility going together? But James says, here in Christ we see our great poverty of spirit, and it is humbling. Humbling to realize that all our plans are for naught, and God gives and takes away at will. This leads us to the place of realizing all God has is ours, and all that we have is God's. God's economy calls for a reprioritizing of those things in our lives that really matter. I remember when I was a young youth pastor at Quincy. We hadn't been in Quincy very long, and the pastor who I was working with at the time, Ed Burns, invited me to go along kind of on a pastoral ride-along. We were going to visit somebody who was sick, and I didn't really know her. I didn't know the situation at all. But we went out, and I met Carrie. Not my wife, Carrie. This was another Carrie. I met Carrie, and we talked a little bit, and we prayed together, and I found out that Carrie was dying of cancer. And we talked about that a little bit, and I didn't really have much to say. I just put my big listening ears on and tried to not say anything really stupid. But one thing that shook me was something I'll never forget that Carrie said. She looked at me and she said, I will always thank God. Every day, I thank God for my cancer. And when she said that, I couldn't believe it. It was unbelievable that she would say that. And I think she saw the looks of disbelief on my face, at least my face, and she said, it's taught me the things that really matter. And it's reminded me of the people in my life that really matter. It's helped me to reprioritize my life. It's become the lens that shows me the true value of people and the true value of stuff. One pastor put it this way. He said, Paul doesn't just say we rejoice in the midst of suffering, period. He says we rejoice in the midst of suffering because it produces something. What does it produce? Look at the next phrase in your study Bibles, he says. We rejoice in the midst of our suffering, knowing that our suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character is the blockbuster term here in Romans 5. That's the Greek term dokiamos. And it literally means someone or something that has been put to the test and is measured up. If you've ever traveled to the Middle East, you may have taken note of the fact that you can visit a potter and you will look at a vessel, a jar, and it's been through the furnace and it's been through the fire and it hasn't cracked. It hasn't broken. It comes out whole. It comes out complete. And when you turn that vessel and you turn that jar over, and on the bottom there is stamped dokiamos, which means approved. This is a vessel of character. It has withstood the test of the furnace where it has been refined and it hasn't broken. It is whole, complete. That's character. That's really what God's messed up economy is all about. It's designed to teach us godly character, to teach us Christ-likeness. And then James follows it up with this application of God's economy when it comes to sin and temptation. Apparently there were some who were saying, God is tempting me. Well, James makes it clear that temptation is a me problem, not a God problem. Temptation comes from my mixed up value system that says short-term pleasure is worth the long-term cost. Temptation isn't from God, it's from inside of us. To say that God is tempting me is to miss the fact that God is always good. If we are tempted during a trial, and it's interesting in the Greek, test, trial, and tempt, it's all the same Greek word. God is always good. If we are tempted during a trial, that's us. That's our sin nature, not God who's at fault. Don't do what Israel did in the wilderness when they were on their exodus, when they blamed God for their circumstances. God was refining them. God was leading them from slavery into freedom, and yet all they could do was grumble and complain about how good things were back in Egypt and how God was leading them to their doom. They needed to grow up. It's not the easy times that make us who we are, but the difficult ones. A man who many believed was the greatest American president is a good example. When he was 7 years of age, his family was forced out of their home and he went to work. He went to work at 7. When he was 9, his mother died. He lost his job as a store clerk when he was 20. He wanted to go to law school but didn't have the education. At 23, he went into debt to be a partner in a small store. 3 years later, the business partner died and the resulting debt took years to repay. When he was 28, after courting a girl for 4 years, he asked her to marry him, and she turned him down. On his third try, he was elected to Congress at age 37, but then failed to be reelected. His son died at 4 years of age. When this man was 45, he ran for the Senate and lost. At age 47, he ran for the vice presidency and lost. But at age 51, he was elected President of the United States. That man was Abraham Lincoln, a man who learned to face discouragement and move beyond it. Did you know that it was Abraham Lincoln who, in the midst of the Civil War in 1863, established the annual celebration of Thanksgiving? Lincoln had learned how important it is to stop and thank God in the midst of great difficulties. All right, some last thoughts on trials and temptations. First one is this, that you are not alone. You're not alone. In your trials, in your adversity, in the tests that you're going through, one thing the enemy likes to do is position us in such a way that we feel like that we're just alone through this whole mess. That no one is for us. But you are not alone. God is for you. And if you are part of a faith community, I can say with some level of certainty as a pastor, your faith community is for you. We love you. You are not alone. The second is this, that we should be doers of the word and not merely hearers. We'll get into this a little bit next week. But we shouldn't be double-minded, saying one thing and then doing another. It only adds to that brokenness, to that dissonance in our life. Keeps us from being a whole person. James will go on and talk about this a little bit later, but he says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, just be honest. Just be honest. Third thing is we must be doers and not merely hearers of the words, because it's the best witness for Christ that we have. It's better than any evangelism tract. It's better than any fiery sermon that we could preach. That consistency of faith in our lives, that consistency of Christ-like love in our lives, that consistency of character, godly character in our lives, will say more to people than any tract that we will ever give them. And if our lives are dissonant, really dissonant, and so dissonant that everybody's noticing, those tracts will be meaningless. In fact, it may drive someone further from the kingdom if that's possible. All right, fourth thing. We must embrace God's economy and let go of our own. We must value what God values. And what does God value? God values His children. More than anything else, God values His children. God sent His Son. God came and died for His children. This is how we know what God values. We must embrace God's economy and let our own go. And that means being courageous. Because God's economy is hard. Last, we must rejoice. Lest all of these shoulds in James become just more legalism. We must cling to the joy of Christ, especially during trials. Margaret Sangster Phippen wrote that in the mid-1950s, her father, British minister W.E. Sangster, began to notice some uneasiness in his throat and a dragging in his leg. When he went to the doctor, he found that he had an incurable disease that caused progressive muscular atrophy. His muscles would gradually waste away, his voice would fail, his throat would soon become unable to swallow. Sangster threw himself into his work in British Home Missions, figuring that he could still write and he would have even more time for prayer. Let me stay in the struggle, Lord, he pleaded. I don't mind if I can no longer be a general, but give me just a regiment to lead. He wrote articles and books and helped organize prayer cells throughout England. I'm only in the kindergarten of suffering, he told people who pitied him. Gradually, Sangster's legs became useless. His voice went completely, but he could still hold a pen shakily. On Easter morning, just a few weeks before he died, he wrote a letter to his daughter. In it, he said, "It is terrible to wake up on Easter morning and have no voice to shout, 'He is risen.' But it would still be more terrible to have a voice and not want to shout." That's living through adversity. That's being drawn to Christ's likeness in the midst of our own pain, in the midst of our own trials. And that's what James is calling us to. This new economy of God, to embrace this new economy of God, and to love and treat people around us in such a way that they see Jesus. Because when people see Jesus, it transforms lives forever. All right, have a wonderful Lord's Day. I love you. God bless you. Take care.